Let's say the government needs some land for a new project. They take your neighbor's property, but they leave yours alone. Now, you might feel like you've been singled out, maybe even wronged. But how do you actually prove that in a court of law? It's a massive legal challenge, and today we're diving right into the battle over how the courts try to solve it.
You know, the promise of equality is one of the biggest ideas in any legal system. We hear it all the time. But what does it really mean on the ground? Let's explore how you go from just feeling like you've been wronged to actually trying to prove it.
And here in Singapore, the starting point for this whole conversation is Article 12 of the Constitution. It's a powerful guarantee. But those words, equal protection, well, they've sparked a huge debate over one critical question. What's the right test to figure out when that protection has actually been violated?
So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at that core promise of equality. Then, we're going to examine 3 competing legal tests that the courts use. Think of them as contenders in a ring, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. And finally, we'll get into why there's a big debate raging over which one of these should be the ultimate standard.
Okay, here's the first thing you absolutely have to understand. Not all different treatment is a legal discrimination. I mean, governments have to make distinctions between groups of people all the time for all sorts of reasons. The real question is, when does that difference cross the line and become unconstitutional? To figure that out, courts rely on a few very specific legal frameworks.
Let's start with our first contender. And I gotta tell you, this test sets an incredibly high bar for anyone trying to challenge a government action. It's known as the intentional and arbitrary test. So what makes this first test, the Eng Fong Ha test, so tough? Well, it's a 1-2 punch. It's not enough to show you were treated differently. You have to prove 2 things. 1, that the government did it on purpose, and 2, that their action was completely arbitrary, meaning it had no rational basis whatsoever. And proving both, that is incredibly difficult.
The actual case this test is named after shows you just how tough it is. A temple had its land acquired by the state, while a nearby church didn't. I mean, on the surface, that seems like a pretty clear case of unequal treatment, right? But the court found the government had a reason. They called it planning considerations for a new train station. And because there was some rationale, any rationale at all, the action wasn't considered arbitrary and the temple's claim failed.
And that really gets to the main criticism of this approach. The source material points out that this test places a heavy onus, a huge burden of proof, on the individual. Think about it. Proving a complete lack of any rationality is almost impossible, which means this test, in practice, offers a pretty low level of protection for the citizen.
So, if that first test is like trying to climb a sheer cliff, what's the alternative? Well, the second approach is the most common one you'll see. It's called the reasonable classification test.
This one has 2 steps. First, is there a clear, understandable reason for separating people into different groups? The law calls this an intelligible differentia. And second, does that distinction logically connect to what the law is actually trying to achieve? So it's a test of rationality and connection. Sounds pretty logical, right?
But, and this is a big but, this test has a major potential weakness. While it seems straightforward, critics argue that it can be a relatively low threshold for the government to meet. It's often not that hard for the state to come up with some kind of rational connection, even if it feels a little flimsy.
And here's the biggest trap, something called circular reasoning. Stick with me here. Imagine the government passes a law that only applies to people who wear blue shirts on Tuesdays. If they define the goal of the law as, well, regulating people who wear blue shirts on Tuesdays, then the law automatically passes the test. See how that works? It becomes this meaningless, self-fulfilling loop instead of a real check on power.
This brings us to our third and final contender, a much more modern test designed to fix the weaknesses of the other 2. It's called the Said Suhail approach, and it introduces a really powerful new idea. So, step 1 is the same. Is there a clear distinction between the groups? But step 2? Step 2 is a total game changer. Instead of just asking if the reason is rational, it asks a much tougher question. Is the reason legitimate? And that one-word shift from rationality to legitimacy is huge. It's a much more probing standard. This change gives courts the power to look deeper into the government's justification and ask, okay, is this not just logical on some basic level, but is it a genuinely acceptable and fair reason in a constitutional democracy? It really raises the bar.
Okay, so we've met our 3 contenders. Now let's put them side by side and see how they really stack up in this battle of the legal tests.
This table lays it all out so clearly. Just look at the row for burden on citizen. For the first test, it's extremely high, the second is medium, but the third, Syed Suhail, is more balanced. And then look at the protection level row. You see the exact same pattern. The protection for your rights goes from low to moderate all the way up to high with that final test. That focus on legitimacy is what makes all the difference.
And this brings us right back to that critical problem of circular reasoning, that blue shirt loophole we talked about. The standard approach, test number 2, is really vulnerable to it. But the Syed Suhail approach, it slams that door shut. By demanding that the reason itself be legitimate, it forces the government to give a justification that can stand on its own 2 feet, which stops the test from becoming just a rubber stamp.
Now, this comparison raises a pretty big question. If one test is so clearly stronger and fair, why not just use that one all the time? And that leads us to the final part of our explainer, the big debate over a single, unified approach.
Because right now, the legal landscape is kind of fragmented. As you can see, different tests are used for different situations. You might face the standard test when you challenge a law itself, but the stronger Syed Suhail test when you challenge a specific administrative decision. And this creates confusion and, more importantly, it can lead to inconsistency in how this fundamental right is protected.
So, based on this whole comparison, the source material makes a really powerful argument. It basically says, let's make the Syed Suhail test, with its robust focus on legitimacy, the one unified standard for all cases that involve Article 12.
And why does this matter so much? Because unifying under a stronger test isn't just about legal tidiness. It's about making sure that the promise of Article 12 has real teeth. The ultimate goal, as the source puts it, is to accord the full measure of these constitutional liberties to every single person.
And in the end, this whole debate about legal tests and different standards, it all comes down to a timeless question. In that delicate balance between the power of the state to govern and the fundamental rights of every individual, the choice of a test is really about deciding where we, as a society, choose to draw that line.